What's up, everybody? Rob here. So, all good things must come to an end. So, if you've been following along with my look at early modern warfare for the past couple of videos that I have on this, it's been mostly about pike and shot formations in some capacity or another. And, well, innovation waits for no one, and warfare is no different. So, yes, this is pretty much a video about the end of pike and shot warfare. Now, unlike my other videos where I'm talking about specific innovations, for example, the Spanish Tercio or Gustavus Adolphus and his innovations, very specific events, these are a number of factors that none of them are really worth making an entire video on individually. I mean, I could, I guess, but I'd really have to stretch it out. But instead, I'm going to be looking at a bunch of these things, basically, if not brought an end to pike and shot formation, or at least innovations in warfare during this particular time period. So basically, I'm going to be covering, in very broad strokes, of course, things from basically the late 17th century to the early 18th century, give or take a few years. Again, these are very broad strokes and just general innovations that occurred rather than any specific events. So, yeah, basically, here we go. A very brief look at the end of pike and shot formations and the rise of flintlock tech. All right, here we go. So the first thing I want to talk about here is not necessarily an innovation, but rather a continuation of a trend that had been going on for many centuries at this point. So the feudal system during the Middle Ages had been collapsing. Some people say it's been collapsing as early as the 1350s after the Black Death. Some people say it came later for various reasons. Mercantilism was happening. Basically, proto-capitalism was going on. Some say it's combination of the two. Some say it's other you talk to 10 different people, you'll get 11 different answers. The point is, though, is that the feudal system was giving way to centralized government authorities. So more and more control was being turned over to a centralized state. So the bulk of armies, which would be made up of feudal levies, basically part-time soldiers made up of the peasantry, they'd be drafted or conscripted or volunteer for military service for a single campaign. And also, of course, there was the very heavy reliance on mercenaries who were, let's just say, of dubious quality. Let's just leave it at that. They would be raised for a specific or hired for a specific campaign, and then at the end of the campaign, they'd pack up and go home to go back to farming or whatever it is they were doing. Instead, at this point here, basically, we're talking roughly 1640s, more or less the end of the 30 Years' War, 1648. Armies were more and more, and pretty much by the end of the 30 Years' War, it was pretty much the norm, where armies would be organized and equipped by a centralized state in permanent standing regiments. And these regiments, these soldiers, were basically permanent soldiers. They didn't have to worry about farming. They didn't have to worry about going back home to complete whatever, to provide for their families or anything like that. Their job was to be a soldier, and that was it, which actually cut back on desertions because, well, your job is to be a soldier, so be a soldier. You don't have to worry about getting the harvest in or anything like that. Now, this had a number of ramifications. One of the first is that this actually allowed specialized training. When the soldiers are in peacetime, rather than having to worry about, bringing the harvest in, they could actually train. They could march in formation. They could practice using their weapons more effectively and basically work and coordinate with other regiments in a much more effective manner, rather than just being like a part-time peasant. Okay, by the way, here's a spear. There's some guys over there that, speak a different language than you. Go stab them. So because the raising, maintaining, and training of soldiers was now under the control of a single powerful state rather than feudal overlords, it basically meant that standardization was the name of the game. There would be mass production of weaponry and equipment, or at least as close to mass production as you can get, given that this is a pre-industrialized society, and they would be issued to soldiers from state warehouses rather than provided by the soldiers themselves or, say, a feudal overlord. And this is no more apparent than in an innovation that came about in the latter portion of the 17th century, the uniform. The idea of soldiers using uniforms was, there were some early attempts, I guess you can say, if you consider heraldry to be a form of uniform. Yeah, I mean, you are basically identifying a lord and people who are directly associated with and directly work for him, his retainers and such. But the average soldier did not wear uniforms. They basically wore whatever they can get a hold of. For example, during the Agincourt campaign, Henry V had his soldiers have to identify them from enemy fire, or to prevent friendly fire accidents, rather. They would have a red cross of St. George on them. And this would imply that people weren't already doing this, and he had to tell his soldiers to do this to avoid, potential accidents. And of course, there are other ways as well throughout history of, wear this color armband or some other such thing to avoid basically blue on blue. But the idea of individual soldiers or all the soldiers of an army wearing the exact same clothing with the same cut, same style, and in the same color was very new and really something that only was adopted in the mid to latter portion of the 17th century. Now, uniforms have multiple uses. First off, there is the friendly fire aspect of it. Basically, in the confusion of battle, and as gunpowder was becoming more and more prevalent, gunpowder weapons at the time would set up a giant plume of bluish gray smoke, and it was hard to see who was who, and you would basically just see like figures out there, and you don't know who's who, and it's hard to tell what's going on here. So basically, if you like say you're doing a bayonet charge and you're wearing bright red because you're in the British Army, and the guy standing right in front of you emerging from the gun smoke is not wearing bright red, oh, okay, that guy's an enemy, light him up. Or stab him because it's a bayonet charge, but you know what I mean. Or, oh, I'm wearing bright red and that guy's wearing bright red. Okay, yay, we're on the same team. Basically red team versus blue team. Also, it's an easy way for commanders, again, in the fog of battle. Oh, look, there's a giant blob of guys in red. Those are my guys. Yay, okay, that's our soldiers. Oh, moving on the left. Okay, they're moving forward on the left. Good for them. Or, wait, there's a bunch of guys not wearing red moving this direction. Okay, send reinforcements there. Vast oversimplification, but you get the idea. It's easier to identify soldiers in the chaos and confusion. Battles are pretty chaotic and confusing anyway. Now you have this giant plumes of smoke coming up everywhere that made it even more difficult. Uniforms certainly helped out with proper target identification. But on a more psychological level, it made a soldier part of a larger whole, at least made them feel like they were part of a larger whole. Because warfare required intense amounts of coordination, especially with these newer methods of warfare, linear formations, complex maneuverings, oblique maneuvers, and such and like. This gave a sense of esprit de corps. You were a small part of a larger whole. You were part of something larger than yourself, which is very important for the human psyche. Also, on a much more pragmatic note, it also makes it very easy to spot deserters. Usually people who were in the military were of the relatively poor sort. They didn't usually have a second change of clothes. The only clothes they had would be their uniforms. And if you have somebody wearing basically a military uniform who's not where he's supposed to be, pretty good bet that the guy's a deserter and he can then be arrested and punished. Oh, and on just a side note, color was not really done for any reason other than usually economics. For example, the famous British red, that was actually done for economic purposes. During the English Civil War, the parliamentary forces were reorganizing their army into what would be the new model army, and red was the cheapest cloth available, so they just went with that, and afterwards it just sort of became tradition. If green was the cheapest cloth, they would have gone with green. If blue was cheaper, they would have gone with that. Basically, the whole idea of people, small aside here, but the British, they wore red to hide the blood. No, that's just absolutely ridiculous. No, it was because it was the cheapest. Oh, and I just also want to point out when it comes to uniform, at least throughout the 17th century and into the 18th century and 19th century, basically until like World War I, the standardization of colors, like British red, the Prussians wore blue, the French wore white, and then after the French Revolution they wore blue, etc., etc. That was actually mostly for line infantry. Cavalry forces would have, and other specialist troops, for example, the 95th Rifles during the Napoleonic era, they wore green. Cavalry units basically wore whatever color their regimental commander felt like. And so, yeah, the British redcoats, the British wore red, well, only the line infantry did. Yes, kind of rambly there, but, whatever. Oh, and since we are talking about things that soldiers were wearing, just a real quick little note here about armor. Now, armor had been used throughout basically since organized warfare came into being, but it really just ceased to be a major factor here. There were specialist troops that used it all the way through till, the 20th century, but, for the most part, armor fell out of favor for a couple of reasons. The big one was economic. Again, you have a single centralized state taking control of finances rather than the costs being diffused over a much broader array of people, several feudal warlords. You had one entity trying to pay for everything, and then combine this with the fact that armies were growing in size. Having armor for your soldiers, trying to equip all of your soldiers with armor just simply was not economical. It was just too expensive to do so. Also, firearms at this point were becoming more and more reliable and much more powerful. Now, early firearms actually could be deflected by armor. There's very famous, actually you'll see it right here. This is a piece from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it has a dent in it that is basically a test shot to prove that this armor can in fact stop a bullet. However, as firearms were becoming much more powerful, you would have to make armor thicker and thicker, and it would cover less and less of the body because it would just simply be too heavy and too cumbersome and just honestly too expensive, even on an individual level. So it just, for a combination of technological factors and economic factors, by the dawn of the 18th century, armor had pretty much fallen out of favor. However, again, specialist units, cuirassiers and such, they would continue to use armor well into the 20th, well, not well into the 20th century, at least until modern warfare, World War I, but that's another story. But basically, armor, no more. So now that we have the organization out of the way, time to get into the interesting part, the changes in weaponry. So up to this point, if you've been following my other videos on early modern warfare, it had been dominated by Pike and Shot. Now, whether this was in the Spanish Tercio or in the linear tactics of Gustavus Adolphus and Maurice of Nassau, it's still the same basic principle. You have pikes, which are very long spears, 15 to 20 feet in length, and the shot part would be, well, firearms, early firearms, usually in the form of matchlock muskets. And the two of them would be used in conjunction with one another. So a pike is actually pretty simple. It's just a very long spear. The Macedonians used them, and the successor states of Alexander the Great, they all used pikes until the Romans supplanted them. But, that's pretty much all you need to know about them for the time being. I've explained them in depth in other videos. Pikes, basically long spears. The other weapon you need to worry about here, or the other weapon that I'm going to be talking about here, is the matchlock musket. Now, if you'll look at the matchlock musket here, this is the mechanism here. The way it works is that there would be a main charge of powder down the barrel with a musket ball at the end of it, and there would be a pan that would be filled with gunpowder, and then a burning match cord would be fitted into the hammer that you see there. And when you pull the trigger or activate the mechanism, this burning match cord would descend, strike the powder in the pan. This would ignite that powder, which would then travel through a tiny hole in the base of the barrel of the firearm. It would then ignite the main powder charge, which would then send the bullet out the front. That was the main firearm that was in use. There were others as well. For example, the famous wheel lock, which I'm not going to talk about here, but, the wheel lock was around, but it never really caught on all that much. And that was the main firearm that was in use. However, this would be replaced by the flint. This would be used from the late 17th century all the way through into the mid-19th century. So this technology, once they had it, had been around, would be the main firearm for at least 2 centuries. The flintlock works in basically the same way as the matchlock, but rather than using a burning match cord, it uses a piece of flint that you see there in the jaws of the hammer, and when the trigger is pulled, the hammer drops and it strikes the flint against a steel frizzen, which creates a shower of sparks, which then ignites the primer charge, which then ignites the main powder charge and sends the ball out the front of the barrel. It's the same principle, but instead of using match cord, you use steel and flint, hence the name flintlock. It was first used in the latter portion of the 17th century by grenadiers. Grenadiers are big, strong dudes who would carry basically grenades, and they were hand bombs, and they would be used for taking out field fortifications. And you can't be fumbling around with this burning match cord while at the same time basically walking around with giant bombs. So you had to have the safer flintlocks, and eventually this was adopted by the rest of the army. Flintlocks, in comparison to matchlocks, are safer for that reason. When you're dealing with loose powder, even if you're not a grenadier, having an open ignition source in the form of a match with loose powder around, that's basically a recipe for disaster. In addition to being much safer, it also has a higher rate of fire because you didn't have to fumble around and worry about this match cord, so you can, reload with a little more confidence, which does increase the speed, and it also is much more reliable, which means that more shots actually go down range. And the final piece of military hardware from this era that we're going to be talking about here is the introduction of the bayonet. Now, bayonets are actually incredibly simple. They are simply a knife or other sharp pointy thing that is put on the end of the muzzle of a rifle or a musket. Early attempts at this were originally created, or it was believed to have been created, and are named after the French city of Bayonne, which is located in the Pyrenees near Spain. It is an area that is known for its cutlery. The first attempt was what you see here. This is a plug bayonet. It's basically just a knife with a tapered handle, and you would simply stick this tapered handled knife into the barrel of your musket, and you would turn it into a short spear. There is a problem with this, however, and that is you cannot reload. These are muzzle loaders, so in order to load the piece, you would need to be able to pour powder and shot down the barrel, and you can't do that because there's obviously a knife in the way. So that led to some issues, as you can imagine, thusly limiting their effectiveness. There's also the problem of it not fitting entirely properly, and it would sometimes just fall out, which is, embarrassing. Or sometimes it would fit too well, so when it comes time to actually take this thing out and, use it as your musket as an actual musket, it would be stuck in there. You had to basically get a pair of pliers and try to pry this thing off. It was, it wasn't fun. So one of the first solutions to this was the ring bayonet, which are two rings attached to the handle of a knife, which would solve the problem of the muzzle being clear. The muzzle would not be obstructed by the bayonet itself, allowing the user to continue using the musket as an actual musket. The problem, though, is that there was nothing securing these rings in place. And basically, you would, every time the soldier would move or move the musket around, the muzzle around, the thing risked falling off, which is not something that really you could have in a combat environment. So this was something that it was only described once during the 1680s. And this is the only image I could find of it, so never really caught on. But what did catch on shortly thereafter was the socket bayonet, which is what you see here, and this would be commonly used throughout the Napoleonic era and beyond. So this would be something that would last for many centuries, and actually even today we still use a variant of this. Like the ring bayonet, it solved the problem of the musket not being able to be actually shot and fired because the blade would be offset from the barrel, leaving the barrel and the muzzle clear for actual reloading and shooting, while at the same time it was secured in place with a lug on the end of the musket. So it was locked in place and secured, while at the same time allowing the soldier to actually continue shooting with the bayonet fixed. Now, why was this revolutionary? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's go to some models real quick.
Okay, so what we have here is a bunch of models. This is a Pike and Shot army right here, and we have a bunch of British redcoats here with flintlocks and the socketed bayonet. Now, I've talked about this in other videos right here, but the Pike and Shot really had to work in conjunction with one another in order to be effective. You have the pikemen right here in the center. They are very good in close quarter battle, at least as close as you can get, given that you're carrying a 15-foot spear. And they're very good in a defensive posture. You can basically put up a wall of these pike heads, and enemy cavalry charges would just be stopped instantly. It's very difficult to get infantry through there. This is a very difficult thing to break through. However, they are a vulnerable target because they're packed close together, and they cannot project their power outwards because they can't shoot at their enemies because they're pikemen. In contrast, you have the pikemen here, and you have some crossbowmen here because this is late medieval, but same concept. They are very good at shooting at their enemy because they can actually shoot at their enemy, but they're very bad in close quarter battle. They don't have any sort of melee weaponry aside from hand weapons, say a sword or an axe or something like that, like just a simple hand weapon. More often than not, they would actually just grab the musket by the barrel and swing the thing like a giant club, which is not particularly effective, especially if there's a massed cavalry charge coming towards you. You need pikemen. So musketeers relied heavily on the pikemen. Pikemen relied on the musketeers. Otherwise, the pikemen would be vulnerable to enemy ranged units, artillery, and infantry. Musketeers on the other side, and the musketeers could just be swept right off the field by a swift enemy countercharge. However, as this era continued on, as Pike and Shot continued on, it became apparent that firearms were the way to go. The ratio of muskets to pikes would increase. So there'd be more and more muskets per pikeman. Now, this is mostly pikemen. This is very early. This is late medieval, late 15th century. But there would be, towards like Gustavus Adolphus, I think, had like a 2-to-1 ratio. For every 2 musketeers, you'd have 1 pikeman. And I think it eventually would increase even further beyond that. So just say you have a hypothetical force of just say 1,000 infantrymen. You'd have 700, I'm just, spitballing it here, 700 musketeers against roughly, or with them, working in conjunction with them, about 300 pikemen. You would need to keep those pikemen there just as a defensive force, just in case the enemy were to countercharge, because these guys would pretty much be defenseless against the enemy should they decide to close with them. So that would be a waste of resources. So of the 1,000 men, you have 300 of them that are not projecting their power out. They're not sending lead down range. They're not doing anything other than standing there providing this fortress. And it was becoming apparent that this was not very efficient. However, they couldn't really do anything about it until the introduction of effective bayonets, which is where these guys come in here. Now, these are British redcoats. roughly American Revolution era, but it's a bit different than the type we're talking about here, but close enough for our purposes. And they have the bayonets with the socket, the socketed bayonets here. They can shoot and they can act as their own pikemen at the same time. So you have the same number of soldiers here. There's 24 in each force here. These soldiers can shoot. Again, this is early medieval. This is early Pike and Shot, late medieval. So the ratios would be switched around later on, but it's what I got. In any case, you have these guys can shoot, and these guys cannot. These guys can protect themselves in close quarter battle. These guys cannot. At least not effectively. All of these guys can shoot. 100% of the army can shoot. Also, how many of them can protect themselves in close quarter battle? All of them. So just say, using that same 1,000-man hypothetical force that I was talking about earlier, you have 1,000 men instead of 700 musketeers and 300 pikemen left over that were doing nothing. You now have 1,000 men able to shoot at their enemies. And then you also have 1,000 men also capable of defending themselves against enemy counter charges, particularly against cavalry. Say they put themselves in a square formation like was done at Waterloo. And that's very difficult to break through. It can be broken through, yes. And, obviously a musket with a bayonet on it is not as effective a deterrent against cavalry as, say, like, a pike. But it was certainly more than sufficient to handle the job. So now 100% of the army can defend itself in close quarter, and they can also shoot at their enemy instead of being broken apart like you see here. So the musket with the bayonet as a weapon system together in the hands of an infantry soldier was absolutely revolutionary in warfare and completely changed the way wars were fought.
So with these new innovations, the days of the Pike and Shot formation came to an end. So that is it for the video. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it. And have a good day. Or don't have a good day. You're adults. Have any kind of day you want. See you later.